And we're back talking Fighting Saints hockey after a lengthy hiatus. It's been over 2 months, I believe, since the last time we sat down and talked Fighting Saints. Jack Milewski, Jim Leitner, excited to get the 10th anniversary season here for 2019-2020 going, and it's been a long time coming, but we finally actually have something worthwhile to talk about. The training camp roster has been released for the Fighting Saints. These are most of the players, at least, that will be coming into camp to compete for a roster spot. You have a couple players that on this list will likely be affiliates for the season but are still coming for that camp experience. But we have a lot of returners. That wasn't the case last year, a team that lacked that returning experience, at least from the years previous. They had some players coming back from college, and J.D. Greenway, James Sanchez, and Willie Neerum, who was a Fighting Saints returner just a couple years removed. But this is a team that has a lot of USHL experience, a couple players that played in the USHL last year, not for the Fighting Saints. But you have to start off with essentially a full line, which you don't see much in the USHL, but a full line coming back with Gaber and the Jackson twins. And we talked about this at the end of the season, but it's big to not just have players come back, but players who played together almost all season long. That experience is going to be invaluable for them to start the year.
No question. I mean, you look at that line played together most of the season. They started out the season as a solid line together. You know, we talked about Dubuque not having a lot of experience coming back last year. The numbers were even worse when you looked at the number of points that they had coming back last year. It was they didn't really have any of their high-end scorers coming back from the previous season. But this year you have three bona fide guys who could possibly be in the top 10 in scoring in the USHL at the end of the season, in the Jackson Twins and Reese Gaber. So that gives you a lot of, you're going to get a lot of production out of those three. At times they were super dynamic and they were outstanding hockey players. And as second-year players, they're going to be better, or you can hope that they're going to be better and they're going to have more point production. So that's about as good a line as you can start with. And in my opinion, it might be the best, or it has to be one of the best in the USHL coming back in terms of point production and, veteran leadership, and what you're going to get from them. And, on the other hand, you got one full summer of weight training and off-ice training for three guys who hadn't played in the USHL before. So, as good as they were last year, I expect all three of them to take a big step forward this year and be really dynamic.
And what will be a little bit different for them, at least, is, as you mentioned, there will be more expectations on them, but they've also had a year to learn the league. So I think that's a trade-off that the Fighting Saints will take. And Gaber had over 50 points. Dylan and Ty were over 40. So they had almost 140 points combined last year. You think that could at least increase 20 to 30 points, between 10 to 15 per person.
Yeah, and you look at, they had long droughts where they just weren't producing, and I think where you're going to see the biggest step forward for all three of those guys is they're going to be a lot more consistent. I think at the beginning of the year they came out guns a-blazing, and teams started to try to figure them out, or they did figure them out, for a stretch there, and I think the three of them kind of hit a little bit of a wall. But this year, I think you're going to see a lot more consistency out of all three of those guys. There are going to be nights when they get held off the score sheet, but they're not going to be 2-3 nights in a row. They're going to be a lot more consistent, and they're going to put up a lot more points.
Absolutely, and not just the Jackson Twins and Reese Gaber coming back as part of the forwards from last year's team, but you also have Cooper Haar, who I believe played all 62 games last year, so he was a mainstay in the lineup, very consistent, and really grew towards the end of the year. You have Mason McCormick, who started as an affiliate but was here with the team all year long, and I think even though he didn't play a lot, probably learned a lot from his experience with Dubuque. And finally, Bram Shearer, who also, like Haar, I think took some big strides at the end of the year. So you have the high-caliber offensive players, but you have three guys who were key depth components last year that might be able to add something to this year's team if they make it.
And you mentioned, I thought you hit the nail on the head. Those guys were nice key players, but at the end of the season, when you needed points, they came up big time. In particular, Haar and Shearer, I think there were times when the playoffs, they came up with big time contributions, and it's so important to have that kind of veteran leadership. And in your locker room, and it's nice to have that many guys back.
Yeah, and you speak about veteran leadership. You'll see that on the back end this year, especially. Michael Feenstra has now been a part of the Fighting Saints organization for 3 years. He makes the training camp roster. Aiden Fulp feels like he's been around for about 17 years. He makes the training camp roster as one of those veteran leaders who I think would have had a much better season last year had it not been interrupted with a couple of injuries. Then you keep going down the list for defensemen who played a good part in the team last year, and Luke Robinson, who was acquired mid-season from the NAHL, will be back here on the training camp roster, along with Kalen Taylor. So those players who played a bunch on the blue line for the Fighting Saints will be back this year, and you have a bunch of four experienced defensemen in the Fighting Saints organization that are coming back that should add a big boost.
Well, and what I really like about those guys is you have 3 guys there, Feenstra, Fulp, and Taylor, guys who possibly could have gone to college this year, but they recognize that they need a little bit more seasoning, a little bit more development down in the USHL, and that's going to pay big dividends for the Fighting Saints. You can't underestimate the value of having veteran defensemen in the USHL, and I think we saw that at times last year where, if you're a little lacking in the experience department on the defensive end, you're gonna struggle. And we've seen that the last couple of years, actually. But, with these guys coming back, they've got a lot of experience. They've got a lot of USHL games under their belt, and that makes a big difference. Aiden Fulp in particular, you saw the kind of strides he made last year over the previous season. He was almost like an entirely different player in terms of experience and what he brought to the table. And, when you get that much experience across the board on your defense core, it makes a huge difference.
And not only do they have the experience of USHL experience coming back from the Dubuque organization, but they picked up a couple players who have USHL experience, ties with different teams, and we start on the defensive end again because we're just talking defensemen, but Ben Schulteis, who finished the year with the Minnesota Magicians in the NAHL, but he started the year with the Green Bay Gamblers, and the first couple times Dubuque played Green Bay, we saw Schulteis on the ice. He's a right-shot defenseman, which Dubuque didn't have a ton of last year, so that immediately fills a need just based on the analytics side of things, having enough right shots. But he's also a big body that can take away a lot of space down low, kind of like J.D. Greenway did with a long reach, a rugged defenseman that should help out with the USHL experience he has.
Well, and in talking to Oliver David at the USHL draft, he was salivating over that pick because he was Schulteis was a guy that they wanted to get during the season. They had talked about acquiring him from Green Bay during the season, and they didn't quite pull the trigger on it. So he was pretty happy to get him basically for nothing in the draft. But again, that's a guy USHL experience, and you can't have enough USHL experience on your back end.
And possibly the biggest draft pick of the offseason didn't even come in the traditional USHL draft. It came during the dispersal draft with Central Illinois no longer having a team for this upcoming season. Stephen Halliday taken by the Fighting Saints with their first-round dispersal draft pick. And you talk about highly touted prospects. The 17-year-old from Canada is projected to go possibly in the first round of the upcoming NHL draft in 2020. And he has all the tools and all the makings of a power forward that can succeed at the highest level.
He's a big body. He's a guy who's committed to the University of North Dakota. And I know a lot of NHL teams really covet guys who are going to college programs like that. He's right now. I know the Hockey News had him projected, as a late first-round pick, and it's a lot of expectations to live up to, and it's going to be a challenge for him. But in speaking to him at the camp and also after the expansion or the dispersal draft, he's pretty motivated and he's pretty excited to come here and play in Dubuque, and he's going to be a huge addition. Obviously, he's going to be a top 6 forward and a guy who's got the makings of a guy who's going to produce a lot of points and a big rugged body. So I'm excited to see him. It's going to be you already have a lot of good scoring depth coming back, and to add a guy like that is going to definitely be a big boost for the Fighting Saints offense.
And now we talk about, before we go to our break and then look at some of the newer faces, there are still some other players that had Fighting Saints ties last year. All of them were affiliates last year, and now we might see at least a few crack the 30-man roster and even the 23-man roster this season for Dubuque. But in that, you're talking about youngsters like Ryan Beck, Braden Doyle, who was picked in this last NHL draft by the Los Angeles Kings, moving down the list to Wyatt Kaiser, who had a phenomenal season at Andover High School, and even further down when you look at Ian Pierce, who also had a very solid season. 3 young defensemen that will try to crack the team this year. And then Ryan Beck, who, in terms of growth, he's had an absolutely exceptional offseason. He played with Bell Tire U16 and U18, finished the season, came right to Dubuque, played a couple minutes in playoff games, but got a lot of USHL experience just in the locker room, committed to Denver less than a month after the season ended, and has done nothing but perform in every tournament and game he's played in since. He was exceptional at camp, and I think he has a legit shot to make this year's team because he's really boosted his stock in a quick amount of time.
Well, I think the big boost, and the Saints have been doing this for years. At the end of the season, they bring affiliates in for a month or so, or at the end of the season, or, when prep school guys are on spring break, they come for a week or 2. And you can't replicate the experience you get from being in the locker room, going to practice every day, even living outside of your comfort zone, living with a billet. You get that exposure to the USHL, the lifestyle and everything like that, and it gives you a real good wake-up call. You get a pretty good feel for what you're going to have to do to stick here. And we've seen a lot of really good success stories over the last 6 or 7 years of guys who come in at the end of the year, get that experience, and then the next year they just take off like wildfire. So hopefully, the same holds true with some of those guys as well. When you play prep school hockey or high school hockey or midget hockey, a lot of times you go and you dominate at that level, and it's, sometimes it's a little too easy for you. Mm-hmm. You come to the USHL, and it's hard. I mean, it's not easy at all, and you learn what you have to do to get to take that next step. And, a lot of times you take that home with you over the summer, and you put a little extra into the weight room or in your off-season workouts so you're prepared for it 100%.
So a lot of familiar faces making the training camp roster for the Dubuque Fighting Saints. Again, the players will start trickling in here in the next week or so, but these are a lot of familiar faces that not only add a familiarity with the Fighting Saints, but add a lot of USHL experience in general, and not just on Dubuque, but also with players like Schulteis and Stephen Halliday that have made this Fighting Saints training camp roster. It will be interesting to see how many of the younger guys, the Becks, the Doyles, the Kaisers, would be able to crack the 30-man and maybe 23-man roster for the Fighting Saints. Still have some more players to talk about on this training camp roster. We'll do so after the break, and we'll look at a lot of new faces that maybe fans aren't as familiar with when talking about the Fighting Saints. A bunch of picks from this last USHL draft on the other side of the break.